The Helix Dominion War Academy didn't believe in humility. It had been built in the orbital shadow of a collapsing red dwarf. And whoever chose that location had done so deliberately. The way all things at the Academy were done, to remind you. Every single morning when you looked out the viewport and saw that dying star bleeding fire into the dark. That the universe was not interested in weakness. The corridors were chrome and carbon black. The training bays smelled of ozone and scorched alloy. The cadets who walked those halls had been selected, filtered, and in some cases literally engineered to represent the apex of their respective species. Nobody arrived at the Helix Dominion War Academy by accident. You earned your place through genetics, through combat record, through being the sharpest edge your civilization could produce. I arrived 3 years ago. I'm Cadet Orensol, Veil Hybrid, and I've watched enough extraordinary things happen in these halls to have grown selectively numb to spectacle. I've seen a Bryn cadet bench press a dropship landing strut for fun. I've watched a Krath berserker run a full combat simulation with a shattered femur and finish with a better score than most cadets achieve healthy. I thought I understood what elite looked like. I was wrong. And I know exactly the morning I realized it. Started with a jacket, assembly hall. 7 seats, 300 cadets in tiered rows of adaptive seating designed to accommodate every body type represented in the Dominion's military program, from the compact, dense frames of humans to the towering multi-limbed silhouettes of the Bryn heavies in the back rows. That morning, the usual pre-session atmosphere filled the space, the low competitive hum of apex predators in close proximity, each quietly cataloging the others, the way all dangerous things do when forced into the same room. Cadet Drex, Krath, 6 limbs, 3-time regional combat champion from the Solari Belt colonies, was holding court in the upper tier, comparing regeneration rates with 2 Bryn cadets whose names I never bothered to learn because their primary personality trait seemed to be laughing at whatever Drex said. The usual theater of predators who'd never been genuinely threatened, deciding they were the most important things in any given room. I was reviewing targeting data in the 4th row when the hall doors opened and she walked in, human, small, even by human standards, the kind of frame that made the Bryn cadets look like they'd been assembled from spare warship components by comparison. She moved quietly, without the performative confidence most cadets wore like a second uniform, just walked in, scanned the room with dark, unhurried eyes, and found a seat 3 rows below me near the aisle. Standard issue datapad. Standard issue boots, worn but clean. And the jacket. I noticed it immediately because it was wrong. Not wrong in the way that broken equipment is wrong, or wrong the way a tactical error is wrong. Wrong the way a relic is wrong when it appears somewhere modern. It was a field logistics coat, military cut, but old. Genuinely old in a way that modern fabrics don't achieve, because modern fabrics are designed to be replaced. This one had been repaired multiple times. The left shoulder seam had been restitched with thread that didn't quite match the original weave. A patch on the lower right hem had been applied over a burn mark that the patch didn't fully cover. The collar had been turned and reattached at some point by someone who knew what they were doing but had been working with limited materials. The whole garment existed in that particular state of wear that crosses over from damaged into something else. Something that has simply refused to become garbage, despite everything that has tried to make it so. On the left chest, almost faded to invisibility against the dark fabric, was a unit patch. A broken sword over a burning world. Beneath it, barely legible, a designation in Old Dominion script. I couldn't read it from my distance. I didn't think about it much. I was about to look back at my datapad when Drex noticed her. The laugh started at the top tier and rippled down like a pressure wave. "Is that camouflage?" Drex called out, his translator rendering the Krath words with that particular lazy amusement that native Craft speakers use when they want you to know they're not even bothering to be cruel properly. What's it supposed to blend into? A recycling facility. The Bryn cadets found this hilarious. One of them made a comment about humans not being able to afford ballistic weave, delivered in the tone of someone who considers themselves generous for acknowledging that inferior species exist at all. Someone else chimed in about primitive textile technology. The hall picked it up the way crowds always do, not because everyone found it funny, but because laughing along is safer than the silence. That might mark you as sympathetic to the target. The human girl didn't react. She sat down, draped the jacket over the back of her chair, and opened her datapad. The datapad, I noticed, was filled with notation, dense, handwritten annotation layered over what looked like very old tactical documentation. She was reading it, actually reading it, while a third of the hall laughed at her. Like the laughter was weather. Like it was simply a condition of the environment. She had already calculated and decided was not worth the energy. Expenditure of her response. The laughter was still. Going when the hall doors opened again, I have tried to describe what happens to a room when Supreme Warlord Sereth enters it. And I have never found language adequate to the experience. Part of it is the physical fact of him, 7 feet of hybrid combat evolution. The result of a wartime history complicated enough that 4 different species could claim partial ancestry without being wrong. All of it assembled into a frame that moves with the specific economy of something that has never once needed to perform menace, because the actual thing is sufficient. His scales absorb light at a frequency that makes him look slightly less present than the space he occupies. Like reality is rendering him at slightly lower resolution than his surroundings, and his 3 eyes, 1 craft amber, 2 the reflective silver of the Bryn command. Cast, track independently with the kind of coverage that means. There is no angle from which you can approach him. Unobserved, but the physical description misses the actual phenomenon. The actual phenomenon is the silence. Supreme Warlord. Sereth walks into a room and every hindbrain in the space simultaneously receives a message in a frequency beneath language. There is something here that has survived things that killed everything around it. And it is currently deciding whether you are relevant. The laughter stopped mid-note. Drex's mouth closed. The Bryn cadets in the upper tier suddenly discovered excellent reasons to study the floor. Sereth moved through the hall the way a scanning array moves, methodical, complete, missing nothing. 300 cadets achieved perfect posture without being instructed. I watched him catalog the room in the way commanders do, not looking for threats because threats had long since stopped being the primary concern, but simply recording, assessing, filing. He passed the first tier. He passed the second. He came level with the 4th row, and then he stopped. He stopped completely. Not the pause of someone who has encountered an obstacle, the full arrest of motion that means something has registered as significant. His 3 eyes had fixed on the jacket draped over the back of the human girl's chair. She hadn't looked up. She was still reading. Sereth moved forward, 2 steps, slow and deliberate, until he was standing directly beside her seat. The temperature in that hall didn't actually drop. I checked the environmental logs afterward. It felt like it dropped. He leaned down, this 7-foot architecture of hybrid combat evolution folding itself toward this small human girl in her battered coat, and his eyes locked onto the chest patch. The broken sword. The burning world. The almost invisible designation in old script. His voice came out quiet. In that silence, quiet was sufficient. Iron 7th. It wasn't a question. It was the sound of recognition, the specific register of a voice that has encountered something it did not expect to encounter and is processing the implications. The human girl looked up. She met his 3 eyes with 2 of her own, no hesitation. The way you look at something when you've been told your entire life what it is and have made your peace with it. Yes, sir, she said. My grandmother's unit. Cadet Mira Voss. The hall was so silent I could hear the processing hum of the environmental system's 3 decks. Above us. Say Rath straightened. Something had shifted in his expression, not softened, exactly. Because softening implied a starting point that was not what it was, but reorganized. The way a tactical assessment reorganizes when new information reframes the entire picture. He looked at her for a moment that lasted longer than moments usually last. And then he turned to face the hall. 300 cadets looked back at him, including Drex, who had gone very still in the upper tier, with the expression of someone who has just realized that the thing they were laughing at was load-bearing. Iron's 7th Ground Division, Sareth said. And his voice had picked up the carrying quality that command voices get when a point is incoming that the speaker considers non-negotiable. Cradle of Ash engagement. 412 standard days. 211 human personnel. He paused. 15,000 Veil extinction drones. No resupply after day 60. Atmospheric processors offline by day 90. Communication blackout from day 104. Another pause. Longer this time, with the weight of someone setting down something very heavy. They did not retreat. They did not negotiate. They simply declined, at every opportunity presented to them, to stop. Nobody moved. Sarath's eyes found Drex in the upper tier. Held there. Cadet, he said, and his voice was almost pleasant, which was worse than if it hadn't been. I believe you had observations about the cadet's equipment. Drex's scales had gone the particular pale that craft scales go when the blood has rerouted to core functions. Sir, front and center, Sareth said. Both of you. The training floor of Assembly Hall 7 wasn't designed for this. It was designed for demonstration, for instruction, for the controlled display of technique. It had seen live engagement trials before. The Academy used them regularly. Because the Academy believed, correctly, that you learn faster when failure has immediate physical consequences, but it had never, to my knowledge, been used the way. Sareth was about to use it, not as a lesson in combat. As a lesson in perception. Drex came down from the upper tier with the careful control of someone managing a situation they cannot afford to visibly panic about. He was large by any standard. 6 limbs, 4 primary combat arms with the dense banded musculature of the Krath warrior caste, 2 stabilizing lower limbs built for both speed and anchor point leverage. His scales were the deep copper green of the Sulari Beltkrath, which carry a mild bioluminescent charge that activates under adrenaline already. Even trying to look composed, faint pulses of cold light were moving across his shoulders and upper arms. His ballistic weave training armor fit him the way armor is supposed to fit someone it was engineered specifically for. Like a second skeleton. Mira Voss walked to the center of the floor and stood there while Drex took his position opposite her. And the distance between them looked like a misprint. She had left the jacket on her chair. She was standing in her base training uniform, arms loose at her sides, and she was looking at Drex the same way she'd been looking at her datapad, attentively, specifically, without apparent emotion. Like she was reading him. Like he was a document that contained information she intended to understand completely. Standard engagement, Sareth said. First to immobilize. No hold. He looked at Mira. Cadet Voss, you have the right to decline. I don't decline, sir, she said, and the hall heard it. Drex's bioluminescence pulsed brighter. To his credit, I don't think it was arrogance in that moment. I think it was the authentic discomfort of a predator who has been placed in a situation that cannot end well regardless of outcome, and whose body is responding to threat stimulus despite his mind understanding the threat isn't physical. He had 6 limbs and 3 times her mass and a combat record that had earned him champion status across 2 regional circuits. He knew it, she knew it. Everyone knew it. None of that is why I was watching her instead of him. I was watching her because of how she was breathing. 4 counts in through the nose, held for 2, 6 counts out. Slow, deliberate, like someone turning down a dial. I recognized the pattern from the human physiological literature I'd reviewed in my second year, controlled vagal breathing, a technique for manually down-regulating the autonomic stress response. She was chemically engineering her own calm. On a molecular level, in real time. 30 seconds before a live engagement with someone who outweighed her by a factor of 4, Sareth said, "Begin." Drex moved exactly the way a 6-limbed craft combat champion moves, which is to say he moved with a speed and complexity that most species simply cannot parse in real time. Upper arms fainting high and wide to occupy visual tracking while lower combat. Arms drove in for the grapple, textbook multi-limb assault. Designed to overwhelm bilateral nervous systems that can only fully attend to 2 threat vectors simultaneously. It was the correct strategy. Against anyone else in that hall, it would have worked. Mira moved toward him, not back. Not sideways. Toward, directly into the engagement space. Inside the radius where his reach advantage disappeared. Where the mass differential stopped being a weapon and started being an obstacle he was carrying. It happened fast enough that I know I didn't fully see it. I reconstructed it afterward from the training bay's sensor logs. She dropped her center of mass, let his upper arms cross over her outside her critical geometry, and her right hand came up and inward to the base of his central thoracic column, just below where the 3rd and 4th spinal nerve clusters intersect in Croth anatomy. Not a strike. A placement. Deliberate, specific, the application of targeted pressure to a location. The size of a credit chip in the anatomy of a moving 6-limbed target. 2 seconds. I timed it on the replay. Drex's legs went out from under him with the completeness of a power interruption. Not a fall, a cessation. His motor functions simply stopped receiving instruction, and he went down. All that mass and ballistic weave and bioluminescent copper-green scale, straight down. With the specific bewilderment of a nervous system that is working perfectly well, and has simply been disconnected from its own body. He lay on the training floor, and his eyes moved, tracking, processing. Confused while the rest of him conducted the tedious business of rebooting. The hall produced no sound. Sareth let the silence run for what felt like a very long time. Then he turned to face the cadets, and his voice when he spoke had the quality of something that had been waiting for the right moment. Human bone density, he said, is an evolutionary overshoot. Their gravity produced a skeleton engineered for a hostile terrain endurance predator. Then their civilizational development removed most of the physical demands that skeleton was built for. What remained is structural integrity that significantly exceeds their apparent requirements. He paused. Compound this with a neurological architecture that processes pain as tactical data rather than a stop signal. They do not stop because of pain. Pain tells them where the problem is. Then they continue. He looked at Drex, still running motor diagnostics on the floor. The Iron 7th held 412 days under conditions that should have produced biological system failure across the entire unit by day 90. Atmospheric degradation alone should have rendered them non-functional. They had compound fractures that were field splinted and walked on. Respiratory damage that was manually managed and continued performing combat functions through. They survived not through superior biology, not through superior equipment. His voice dropped slightly. Through an absolute refusal, encoded somewhere below the level of conscious decision, to accept termination as the outcome. Drex had managed to get his upper arms working. He rolled onto his back, looked up at Mira, and said, rough-voiced, the translator slightly unsteady, but genuine, tactical critique, please. And this, I think, is what the hall had not expected, not the fight, not even the result. This. Mira looked down at him and nodded once. the nod of a professional acknowledging a reasonable request, and proceeded to walk him through, calmly and specifically, exactly where his assault pattern had created the 3 viable counter-entry points she'd chosen between in the half-second before engagement. She pointed to his upper arm extension arc. Too wide in the feint, she said. It created a vector prediction problem. She explained the thoracic nerve cluster geometry in Krath anatomy, where she'd learned it, her grandmother's field notes, annotated through 3 generations of the family, documenting the anatomical vulnerabilities of every species the Iron Seventh had ever fought alongside or against. She suggested 2 adjustments to his opening movement that would close those entry points at the cost of some reach, and told him the trade was probably worth it. Drex listened. Took it in, said, I'll run it in simulation tonight. The secondary cluster is harder to reach, Mira said, but more complete. If you want, I can show you the notation. Yes, he said, just, yes. Seraph watched this exchange with an expression I hadn't seen on him before and couldn't fully classify. Not surprise, because I don't think he's surprised easily. Confirmation, maybe. The look of someone who had suspected what they would find and found it. He addressed the hall one final time, and when he spoke, he wasn't using his command voice anymore. He was using the voice that I'd heard from cadets who'd served under him. He used when he was telling you something he actually meant. Every species represented in this hall, he said, arrived at its current capability by surviving something that should have prevented it from continuing to exist. Krath neural redundancy evolved because your ancestors lived in environments where primary nervous system damage was statistically unavoidable and dying. From it was not an option that natural selection was willing to permit. He gestured around the hall. Bryn multi-limb articulation. Veil cognitive processing speed. Every advantage any of you carries was paid for, in suffering and in death, by the generations that produced you. He looked at the jacket draped over the back of Myra's chair. The difference is that most species eventually developed technology that allowed them to forget the cost, to stop carrying it forward, to let the lesson calcify into pride instead of practice. He turned back to the hall, and his 3 eyes moved across the rows. The Iron Seventh never forgot, he said. It could not afford to. And because it could not forget, it did not stop. Because it did not stop, 211 human personnel held a dying colony for over a year, against a force that should have ended them in a week. A pause. Sergeant Cale Voss, Cadet Voss's grandfather, to those who are doing the arithmetic, dragged me 3 kilometers through active drone territory with a punctured lung at 53 years old. I was 26, in peak combat condition, and I had to be carried. He was bleeding out, and he carried me because the alternative was that I did not make it, and to Sergeant Voss, that was not a tolerable outcome. The briefest shift in his expression. I think about that, regularly. The hall sat with that. Mira had walked back to her seat. She picked up the jacket, checked the collar in an unconscious habitual gesture, the way people check things they've checked 10,000 times before, and settled it over her shoulders. The broken sword in the burning world sat on her left chest, faded almost to nothing, visible if you knew to look. She opened her datapad and went back to reading. 300 cadets. Watched her do it. I don't know what each of them was thinking. I know what I was thinking, because I've thought about it since, reconstructed it, tested it against what I know now after 3 more years in these halls. I was thinking about the difference between a symbol and a record. A symbol is what you make something mean. A record is what it actually is. The jacket wasn't a symbol of the Iron Seventh's legacy or a tribute to her grandfather's valor or a statement about human resilience in the face of species bias. It was a record. Stitched and restitched, patched, burned and repaired. The physical, carried forward, refused to be discarded record of people who had decided, over and over again in circumstances that offered them every reason to decide otherwise, That stopping was not the answer. Drex requested a training session with Mira 3 days later to work on the movement adjustments she'd suggested. She agreed. He became, over the next 2 years, one of the better students of human close engagement methodology the Academy had produced. And he cited her in his graduation tactical thesis. The cadets who'd laughed that morning didn't laugh again. Not about the jacket. Not about anything human-related, actually, in the casual reflexive way that is worse than deliberate cruelty, because it doesn't even consider itself unkind. The recalibration was quiet and total. Sareth paused beside Mira's chair on his way out of the hall. He didn't say anything. He looked at the patch for 1 second, the way you look at something that has cost you something real to understand. And then he walked out. The Academy didn't teach this lesson in any curriculum I ever reviewed. It doesn't appear in the tactical syllabi, or the species integration modules, or the command psychology coursework. It was taught once on a chrome floor in Assembly Hall 7. By a small human woman in a dead man's coat who moved toward a 6-limbed predator when every sensible instinct said move away. And finished the engagement in 2 seconds because she had been studying the documentation her whole life, and the documentation had been written in blood. The danger in underestimating the quiet ones isn't that they'll eventually surprise you, it's that by the time you realize what they are, they've already been surviving things you haven't imagined yet, for longer than you've been paying attention, and they're nowhere close to done.